Go ahead.
All right, we are going to begin the meeting for the Personnel Committee for Wednesday, April 20th. I'm Councilmember Zine. Joining me, Councilmember Bernard Parks. Our chair is en route, but it is now 2:16, 16 minutes after the start. So we're going to begin the meeting, and hopefully our chair will arrive shortly. 3 items on the agenda. There'll be a long discussion on item number 1. So I figure that'll take about 2 hours, and then we can do 2 and 3. Those should move rather quickly.
All I could say, you may be here 2 hours.
It'll be a committee of 1.
Committee of 1, huh, Mr. Parks? Now we have a sidebar with Ms. Gibson here. Let's tell everybody what we're talking about. It's supposed to be open and transparent. All right, we're now joined by our distinguished and tardy chair. But since we started the meeting, we were stalling for you and Mr. Koretz. We were just going to begin with number 1, saying it would take a couple hours, so
and
we haven't
discussed.
discussed
That we make number 2 and 3 consent items unless anyone has objections to that.
Well, that means we can spend 4 hours on number 1.
Well, I think number 1 would be
I just have
item that would merit significant discussion.
significant. Right, Chief?
Okay, and item 1, as you know, was continued from the previous
Well,
meeting.
wait. We're going to do 2 and 3 first, and then we'll go back to number 1.
You're doing on consent?
Consent,
Well, I just have a question on 2 before we consent. What's the cost on number 2? And I have no problem with the approval. Just the cost. How much is it costing?
If that is the case, I have to announce it,
Okay.
and you have to have somebody come to the table. So item 2, the Personnel Department has submitted a report to relative to a 4th-year extension of a contract with Government Jobs Com Inc., otherwise known as NeoGov, to provide automation of the civil service selection process from June 5th, 2011 through June 5th, 2012, with an option to extend the contract for a 5th year.
The cost, it's approximately $106,000.
106?
Yes.
Okay.
To identify myself, Steve Rivera from the Personnel Department.
From the who?
Personnel Department.
Okay. 106, and that gives us another year coverage.
Yes.
Even though we're not hiring, this maintains the system.
Well, we are doing some hiring, not much entry-level hiring, but we are doing a fair amount for DWP and harbor and airports. We're also doing a fair amount of promotional testing.
So you need this?
We need this.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I had.
We have a motion for the item
Motion to approve 2 and 3.
without objections. Now if we take up item 1.
Thank you.
Okay, item 1 was continued from the previous meeting, and the City Administrative Officer has submitted a report relative to increased staffing for the Los Angeles City Fire Department Professional Standard Division. As you know, the Public Safety Committee has considered the item at their meeting of March 7, 2011, and they have recommended approval of the CAO recommendations. At the last meeting, you requested that they provide additional data, and also that they consider the feasibility of considering an ombuds person for this unit.
Chief, if you'd like to make a presentation.
Good afternoon. Village Peaks Fire Chief. What I'd like to do is ask our Deputy Mayor, Eileen Decker, to make a comment. The Mayor's office was intimately involved in the placement of the originally the $1.4 million in the UB account, and if I would, I'll turn it over to Ms. Decker.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Good afternoon, members of council. The chief asked me to come today because he understood there were some questions as to how this originated. And I believe you all are very familiar with the Professional Standards Division and how that came into being, as well as the independent assessor. And with respect to last year...
My 2 colleagues are probably a little more familiar. I wasn't present at the time, so I know it more from a distance, but if you wanted to give a very brief overview of that, you could feel free to do that as well.
Well, I'll make it very brief and perhaps just be available for questions. And I know that there were other people here as well who are intimately familiar with the development of those 2 entities within the fire department. With respect to the independent assessor, That was approved by the voters of the creation of that department, and I believe the first independent assessor for the fire department started in October of 2009, Mr. Stephen Miller, who remains as the independent assessor for the fire department. The Professional Standards Division predated that, and the Professional Standards Division evaluates complaints that are presented with respect to individuals who are employed in the fire department. The independent assessor released a report last year at the end of March. From our perspective, it was just right before the mayor was to release his April 20th budget. And in that report, he highlighted, it was his first report that was issued by the independent assessor. He highlighted a number of issues that remained in the fire department. And one of the issues that he highlighted was the difficulty the Professional Standards Division was having in terms of evaluating the complaints. When Professional Standards Division was originally created, it was estimated that they would get approximately 100 complaints a year to evaluate. It turned out to be about 1,000. So the independent assessor, in his evaluation, indicated that simply not enough resources were applied to the Professional Standards Division. And the report provided by the independent assessor was quite lengthy, as you can see, where he went into detail of a number of instances, how they were evaluated and the delays that were caused. So last year, this was issued in March of 2010, the mayor, when he read the report, had, in consultation with council, talked about providing additional resources to the Professional Standards Division. In his proposed budget given to council, he allocated, I believe it was originally $1.5 million in the UB account to be used to help develop the Professional Standards Division, and then over the course of what we had hoped would be a few months, a more formalized plan would come about to indicate how that staffing could be supplemented to address the issues presented by the independent assessor. And so that money was put into the UB. I recall being questioned on it by members of council last year in, I believe, the Finance Committee when the mayor's budget was presented, and what was the purpose of the money, and it was to address many of the issues highlighted by the independent assessor. And my recollection is council did approve it. Obviously, it's still in the UB, and before this body today is the more detailed analysis of how to put those individuals within the Professional Standards Division. And Chief, if there's anything you wanted to add to that brief summary.
What we'll do is give you an update on what took place since then in terms of how we got to the 8 civilian investigators and how we got here today. I've asked Paul Hayashida, our senior investigator, to take us through that process.
Thank you, Chief. Paul Hayashida, Chief Special Investigator, Professional Standards Division. Good afternoon. One of the things that Ms. Decker spoke about was the 100 annual complaints that was estimated prior to the creation of PSD. And one of the criticisms that came from the 2006 controller's audit that led to the creation of PSD was the fact that there was no formalized tracking system of the number of type of complaints that the fire department received about its personnel, and the belief that a number of complaints were being informally handled by the fire station commanders and the chain of command, so to speak, the supervisors of the line firefighters at the 100-plus fire stations, and that instances, although some of the handling at that level may have been appropriate, that some items of misconduct were not being investigated and identified and appropriately handled. So one of the mandates from the 2006 controller's audit and recommendations from the fire department stakeholders group was the creation of a central tracking system, which was instituted in 2008. That is where we get the 1,200 complaints in 2009. I'm sorry, 2009. And what we believe happened is that for the first time in the fire department's history, all the complaints that were coming into the fire department were not being dispersed throughout the fire stations and handled with no recordation, but they were coming to one centralized place, which was the complaint tracking system in professional standards. That system, we have complaints coming in from the citizens, complaints being made by fire personnel at the fire stations, either through letters, through phone calls, or directly into the complaint tracking system by computer. And a number of other complaints that were not initially tracked in the 100 complaints total were emergency medical services complaints. They were handled by the paramedic captains out in the field. Those were also being added to the total that we are now looking at in terms of numbers. The unfortunate thing was that the initial staffing of the professional standards division was based on that 100 complaint total. And that leads to this, partially to the situation we have now. The other thing that I failed to make clear, or we failed to make clear last week, was that when we speak about that 1,000 complaint total, that is not the number of complaints being handled by the professional standards division. It is the number of complaints being reported to the LA Fire Department, of which in some way or form the professional standards division will manage, either by assigning it to itself, by deeming it according to our criteria to be suitable to be assigned to the fire stations to be handled by the supervisors, or that they're non-disciplinary or do not, they lack merit to be investigated further as a misconduct complaint. But in any event, all of the complaints that come in the complaint tracking system are managed by the professional standards division, and that's that number. If I could provide a little bit of clarification about our process and what the actual numbers are. In 2009, we had 1,165 complaints entered into the complaint tracking system. Last year, it was 985, and then as of this morning, we have 235 complaints in there. As we speak right now, of the 355 active complaints we have right now, and that includes complaints not only reported this year, but are remaining from last year because the statute of limitations is still alive for those 2010 cases. Of those 355 cases, 167 or 47% is being handled by the professional standards division. And the remaining 188 or 53% is being addressed by or investigated by the captains or the battalion chiefs at the 100 plus fire stations in the field or in fire prevention or whatever the outside work assignment is. The criteria for assigning those cases outside of PSD is it's basically an exception thing. If a case is going to be assigned to PSD, it is an EEO type of violation, which was the impetus for the controller's audit and all the processes that made PSD come to being. If it could be criminal, or it is criminal being investigated by outside law enforcement. If it's off-duty conduct, because of the hesitation to mix off-duty conduct with the fire station investigating that. And then the last category is kind of amorphous, is if it's serious or complex misconduct investigations. And what we found that to be is high potential for litigation, something that the media is reporting. The field lacks the training or the ability to handle the type of investigation at issue. It's high profile. And one other category that we've found to be quite time consuming is where it's alleged that our paramedics committed medical malpractice in treating someone in an emergency medical situation. Again, a high liability type of situation. So those are the cases that we keep in professional standards. The rest are relegated to the 700 plus captains and chiefs that work at the fire stations or in other parts of the fire department. The cases that we keep, what happens is when cases are reported in the complaint tracking system, we have a position called the Central Tracking Moderator who reviews the complaint, gets all the necessary documents that weren't submitted with the complaint together, and then they give that file to myself or my co-commander of Professional Standards Division, Assistant Chief Roxanne Bursick. She and or I serve as the initial screening of that file to determine whether or not it should remain in PSD or be assigned to the field. Or if we can dispose of the case as not being a disciplinary matter. We will then have that assigned. If it remains within PSD, then it is assigned to either our internal affairs section, which is headed by a battalion chief, Graham Everett, or to our EEO section if it's appropriate for the EEO section to get it. So those would be the investigations that our current investigators in PSD are handling. And as I just stated, 47% of our existing caseload within the fire department is being handled by the investigators in PSD. Right now, we have 11 full-time investigators and 2 part-time investigators handling those number of cases. One of the other things that was not identified in the 2006 audit and the subsequent processes that went through is the necessity for PSD to put on the department's case at Board of Rights. A Board of Rights hearing is an evidentiary hearing where an accused employee has requested an opportunity to be heard and face their accusers. And the PSD will staff the so-called prosecutors from its ranks to put on the case. In 2008 and 2009, we had 2 Board of Rights each year. As of right now, we currently have 21 Boards of Rights pending. 9 of those that are pending were directed by the department, and that means that the department concluded their investigation and determined that the penalty should be 30-day suspension or more. And under the charter, the fire chief does not have the ability to impose that. It has to be directed to a Board of Rights. The other 12 remaining Boards of Rights are requested by the members who are accused for penalties less than 30 days. So that added burden of actually preparing for and putting on the administrative hearing was another factor that the initial staffing for PSD did not contemplate. Once an investigation is being investigated, if there's any questions about how to handle that case, how to investigate it, questions come back to PSD, and they fall on the shoulders of our Internal Affairs Commander, Battalion Chief Graham Everett. What that means is he's fielding cases, questions about all the cases that are active that may arise from both the field and from the investigators that work for him. On top of that, when a case is completed in our system, an investigation is completed either by professional standards or by the field, they come back to PSD and they're given to the Battalion Chief, Graham Everett, our Internal Affairs Commander, to review for sufficiency and determine whether or not we can sustain charges. Once that's done, if charges are to be sustained, then they come to myself and Chief Bursick with a recommendation for an appropriate penalty. So that's roughly the process in terms of how the investigations run through our division. If a case is challenged, either because the member does not agree with the penalty and wants a Board of Rights, or the department has directed them to a Board of Rights, we have another section which is run by Battalion Chief Karen Richter, which serves to put on the Boards of Rights. Those are mainly the responsibilities of how things run in PSD. The one thing I also believe that we didn't make clear last week are 2 other issues that impact our staffing situation. Number one is the staffing of PSD in the aftermath of the 2006 controller's audit is for 2 fire captains, 3 special investigators to serve as and 2 part-time senior personnel analyst 1s to serve as the investigators who conduct the investigations themselves. We have supervisors and managers within the division, but as far as investigators, we have a total of 5 full-time and 2 part-time. Because of the demands on us, we've detailed a total of 7 fire captains out of the field to assist in serving as advocates doing investigations. And that's only because Chief Peaks has realized what a dire situation we were in. And our entire Board of Rights section, the battalion chief and the captain working on that, are detailed members within that number. So right now we're trying to keep our head above water with staff who are transferred or detailed out of the field to PSD. One of the other things that impacts our ability to put on cases and why we're asking for civilian investigators is basically the issue that fire captains are not trained to be investigators. Councilmember Parks, Councilmember Zine, you worked in a department where you had folks go to an academy, work in the field, work their way up to detectives, sergeants. They have investigative experience. Every day that they're conducting investigations, they understand the process, they understand evidence and whatever else. Unfortunately, the fire department, they train outstanding firefighters, but not investigators. So when we pull these fire captains out of the fire station and bring them in, what we do is we give them 40 hours of training from LAPD Internal Affairs, and then we give them cases. And because the cases in PSD are the more serious ones, we're taking folks with this amount of training with really no core experience and telling them to move forward. We do have myself and 3 civilian special investigators who do have extensive training in investigations and that area, but their numbers don't compensate for what we're missing with the sworn, because most of our offices is sworn. The other thing is that following the controller's audit, the stakeholders group in the Los Angeles Fire Department recognized this deficiency, and one of their mandates was to pair up a sworn and civilian on every case. So in essence, we have 2 folks in there, one that knows the fire department being sworn, the other one probably having more of the investigative expertise and knowledge, paired up. So really, on every case up to recently, we had 2 people on them out of necessity. We've now moved towards having a single investigator on cases, but then we run into that training issue. So those are really the factors that are involved in why we're at the situation we're at now, and why we're here asking for the specific type of investigators that we're asking for. There is one position for a management analyst too, and as I spoke about earlier, the division manages all the complaints that come through, and the first person that accepts that is a management analyst too, who's our central tracking moderator. We're finding a choke point there because on top of managing the intake and the closure of all these complaints, that person is also responsible for our budgeting in PSD, doing our statistical analysis, and any trend analysis based on the totality of the complaints in order for us to try to be a more proactive group. And that's why, in addition to the 8 civilian investigators we're asking for, we feel that that management analyst is just as critical to our mission. And I'm sorry if I was long-winded.
You were.
Oh, not, you were, but it's valuable information, so we appreciate that.
Thank you.
I've got a few questions. First of all, I was under the original misunderstanding that your investigators were following through on all 1,200 odd complaints that come in, and
We didn't make that clear
rather
last
than the smaller number. If the number is 167, I recognize these cases are complex, but you have 13 people now, and you would add 9 to deal with 167 complaints. That seems like a pretty low caseload on its face, although I'm not that familiar with these cases and their complexity.
And if I could address that, when we spoke to Deputy Chief Mark Perez of Professional Standards Bureau of LAPD, they told us that they kept their caseload between 6 to 8 for each of their investigators. My prior experience was with the Inspector General's Office for the State of California. We oversaw the Department of Corrections Office of Internal Affairs. They kept their number around 6. If you take the 10 number and then that factor I spoke about the paired up investigators because of the training issue we have with our sworn, in reality these folks have 10 cases they're primarily responsible for and then 10 that they're the secondary on, which is a necessary evil for us because of the training deficiency. The other thing is,
but you're anticipating that with this allocation, you'd be able to make up for that deficiency by hiring the right people with the right training.
What we're looking for are civilian investigators. The requirements that we were discussing with personnel is folks with 5 years of experience doing internal affairs type investigations in either a police or fire situation. So that would alleviate the need to pair up and have people move on their own. And the other thing, Council Member, is that what may be a relatively not even a complex investigation, relatively minor or simple routine for a police detective or sergeant to do, it challenges us because, again, we're coming from a training base that's non-existent for the sworn before they get here, and then they get 40 hours of training, and they're thrust into some pretty complex cases. And we don't have officer-involved shootings, we don't have pursuits, we don't have excessive force complaints, but some of the medical negligence or malpractice issues we face, some of the workplace environment issues we face, and those are the issues that have brought PSD to existence, challenge us. And a large part of my day, a large part of Chief Everett, Chief Bursick's day, and Chief Richter's day in working with the Board of Rights is we're educating our folks and giving them on-the-job training on how to be investigators at the same time we're doing it. It's a challenge, and it's workable. It's just that right now we're under the gun.
Yeah, it's clearly not a very efficient or effective way to do it, so I see that. On the tracking system, are you making use of that yet or intending to on the preventative side? Because I would hope that if you're tracking all these complaints and identifying the types, that you can look at the circumstances and at some point you would be able through training and enforcement and everything else to reduce certain types of problems and get these numbers down, because the numbers of complaints per individual personnel member seems pretty high. In fact, it was kind of shockingly high to me. I assume to all of you too, if you anticipated 100 in a year and got over 1,000 instead.
And one point I just want to clarify before I answer your question, Council Member, is it is high, but we don't turn every complaint into an investigation. And Chief Bursick and I, when we get the complaint at the intake point, we're looking to see whether or not it alleges misconduct, whether or not it's alleging a non-disciplinary matter, i.e. they're complaining about a policy, they're complaining about an outside agency, they're complaining about something that could be resolved with non-punitive action. There are a number of things that we're looking at to keep from building up everybody's active caseload. So I want to assure you that we're taking very proactive steps at that stage not to make everything into an investigation. However, when I look at a complaint, I began my law enforcement career 30 years ago, and I've been in this realm for probably the last 14 years. I can't tell a complaint whether it's frivolous or not just by reading the complaint. So we have to, at some point, put people on it. To answer your question about our proactive steps, I spoke about the moderator, and she's the one that really puts her hands initially on all the cases and then closes them out. Chief Bursick and I do to some extent, but with all of our other duties, she's the one that really tracks trends and identifies them. She is so busy with what she's doing. If she spots an issue at a specific fire station or a trend in behavior or whatever else, we'll act on that because it was identified in between doing all of our other things. If we discover a policy issue that's not an issue that's not addressed in current policy, we will give that to our planning section and have a policy change occur that way. Is there more we could do proactively? If we had the MA2 position that we're asking for, we believe that we can, because then it would allow a more in-depth analysis of our data and to identify where we can proactively step in and deal with those kind of issues, or deal with, you know what, we got a number of these kind of rumblings at this fire station. Maybe we need to try to identify workplace environment issues there or whatever else. Because, again, if it reaches our door, it's too late. You know, and we totally agree that if we can take measures to resolve any policy or environment issues or trends or lack of training early, we want to do that. But right now, the people that could do that are overwhelmed. The other thing, and
I certainly want to know that if we're approving this level of staffing, that we're getting that kind of analysis. Because if we're just fighting fires, sorry for the pun, but if we're just dealing with these as they come in and resolving them and barely keeping our heads above water and not trying to identify and analyze what the patterns are, I mean, I'd like to come back in a couple of years and hear that we're only getting 400 complaints a year because we've identified some of the types of complaints and we've addressed them and we've come down hard on people that are doing the wrong thing and we've corrected it. Or just made sure people know the policy, I'm sure in some cases, that they're not following and maybe not aware and can be improved through education. I mean, all of those steps, I assume we're fully staffing that piece of it, because I would think that's the most important of all of it.
And I can attempt to address that, and I'm sorry for not being clear. One of the sections that would be created with the additional staffing is a field and support unit. And although it's not to our core investigative functions, it addresses many of the concerns that you just raised. It would be staffed by the management analyst too, and a special investigator, and for right now, a detailed fire captain. And they would perform three functions. One is to address all the questions coming from the field about their cases, about processes that the Internal Affairs Battalion Chief currently handles. But more importantly, those folks would be able to identify training needs, policy issues, make more use of our tracking system to get that data out and analyze it. And that's why we have that position in our anticipated organization chart.
And if we manage to find ways to streamline this process and reduce complaints, Are we hiring all these people on a permanent basis? And is there any chance that if we do this job right, that we'll actually have too many people at some point in this arena?
My professional belief at this point is right now we're doing cases using the full 1-year statutory period that we have, and we're going right up on it. A couple of cases, unfortunately, we've even gone over because we're not getting these things done in time. I believe that the additional civilian investigator staffing will allow us to get the timeliness of our investigations down to a point where we're not holding accused members hostage for that entire year, because that's just as much of a problem as doing the investigations, is having something hang over someone's head for a year. We want to get that down to a 4 to 6 month period. That's our number one goal. But as we do that and we increase the efficiency of our division with the civilian trained investigators, our hope is to be able to release some of the detail captains back to the field where they need to be. So, again, it's not to say that fire captains can't do it, but we think that this mix will allow PSD to be more efficient and allow the fire chief to return the folks that he removed from the fire stations back to where they should be.
Great.
Excuse me, Councilman, I believe the request is for resolution authority, so this body would have the opportunity each year to review this process and see if there are the efficiencies that we'd all like to see.
Thank you. Mr. Zine, do you have any questions?
I have about 2 hours worth.
Well, let's not go the full 2 hours, but...
No, the long-winded is
start.
good because it shows that you know what you're talking about, so I was being facetious when I said you were long-winded. You give a good explanation. You remind me of Jack Webb, just the facts, man. He's got that Jack Webb look. The ombudsman, we talked about that last time. 985 complaints in 2010, 718 handled by chain of command. And when I'm looking to take those 718, while they're logged in and they're tracked, they're not the full-blown investigation to all the investigators. An ombudsman, which we discussed last meeting, and the chief knows my concern about that, to get those issues away from you, still in the tracking system, not tie up your investigators, but how can we resolve this issue? And how that could be a component of this, to relieve your field command, your captains, to do the work they do in the station, to manage the stations properly. Can you comment on that, Chief?
Yeah, our hope is to establish an ombudsman's position within PSD, which potentially would be a rotational position that would handle the non-punitive investigations that would take place.
With the personnel you're hiring in now?
With the personnel that we're hiring in now. So
not additional folks?
No, not at all. So what we would do is potentially, and through our discussions with staff, is each month maybe one investigator would handle that ombudsman's position, and it would rotate month by month. And potentially what they would do is resolve those issues where, let's say there was a difference of opinion. This is a knife, this is a fork, this is a spoon, those types of things that don't rise to the level of necessarily an internal affairs investigation. So we will incorporate that into our system.
And that relieves you of the hassle at the same time addressing the issues and tracking it through.
Absolutely.
Because my focus on it is, if you're going to do this substitute of personnel, let those captains be captains, which they probably want to stay in the field anyway, and not be compelled to do these, which is not what they joined the fire department for.
Right.
Obviously, it's become a necessity that we do that, so that's an important component.
My hope is to get these trained investigators on board, working. We get the fire captains that are detailed to professional standards back to the field, working on fire resources where they belong. So that's my hope, and get the caseload under control. I think the professional standards division, I mean, given the workload, no one anticipated that it was going to explode the way that it did. But unfortunately, we've been given this circumstance. They've managed the best that they can during this period, and I applaud them for what they've done. But I think we've reached a breaking point now, and it's time for us to fix it.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. The compelled statements, the issue I have with your civilian personnel on the situation with a firefighter, can they then order them to give compelled statements on a serious investigation, or do they have to be a sworn member of the department to do that?
Currently, we resolve that one of two ways. One is the fire chief has drafted a letter which we can present to a sworn member advising them that the civilian in front of them is working under the direct authority of the fire chief. And myself and Chief Bursick report directly to Chief Peaks. So we have that option. The other one is we have fire captains in the office. We just have them step in, give the order, and then step out. It hasn't been an impediment at all.
It hasn't been, okay.
No.
The other issue that I have, you mentioned the resolution authorities. I think to benefit this committee and to, maybe the complaints will go down, maybe it won't be forever, because oftentimes there's the initial shock, and then people realize that the department's managed in a different manner. We don't have the situation we've had in the past, litigation, et cetera, that we could have an annual review to come to the Personnel Committee. Maybe the personnel on the Public Safety Committee, as far as where are we with numbers, where are we with the personnel? So that way we could resolve the issue of the resolution authority. Maybe this will be sufficient for the time being for the next year, and if at that time we can reduce some of the numbers of the personnel assigned, or it gets worse, and that way you're not going to be struggling back and forth. So if we could, as part of this agreement on this professional standards, with the expansion of the personnel you're requesting and the swap out of the sworn for the civilians for the investigation, if we could get an annual review to give us a focus on where are we with the numbers, where are we with the personnel issues, and I think that addresses the issue when we talk about to resolve those issues and those questions about permanent versus temporary. Not that someone's coming for a permanent job, but then we can review it a year later. How are we doing with it, with the resolution authorities? So I think, Mr. Chair, I'd make a motion to add that to the focus. But the chief and I had a discussion, and I think that what you're looking at, and we're getting a better view of what you're trying to accomplish, and with the mandate that's been established in the charter, that the chief can run the fire department, and the firefighters that want to be professional fighters and do it in the right fashion, and that structure's there, and those that, for whatever reason, because we see that in employment, some people go the wrong way on things, there's a system in place to correct that and to manage that, so the public benefits from knowing we have a professional fire department. If someone goes out and does something that's egregious, there's consequences. And not to put the captains in an awkward position where they're buddies working together in a living environment, and now they're investigating the same personnel, and it kind of makes a unique, unusual, somewhat uncomfortable mix. I remember when I was with the police department, I worked internal affairs, and you were separate and distinct from the people you were investigating. It's a lot cleaner system. And if it's that minor stuff, then you could have that ombudsman focus take over, and they could help resolve it and hopefully bring that to an end, so it doesn't rise to a higher level, which to me is part of risk management when you have that part of that component. So I would support the position with the conditions that we've attached to it, and if we can get a report back in the year and see where we're going from that, then let your captains be captains and get the other operations staffed, and then you can continue doing what you're doing. So I commend you for what your insight into this particular unique field, especially for the fire department, because it's not a traditional role. Thank you.
Mr. Parks?
Let me just, because I've been at this since 2006, and maybe you can clarify some issues for us. One of the things I think when we discussed this way back when, everyone wasn't really surprised as to the ultimate outcome and number of complaints, because it was pretty well agreed that nobody knew how many complaints were in the system. And I think that was the whole issue that came to light during the controller's audit and all the other things, is that because of the way it was dispersed, no one knew what was out in the field, and no one knew how much misconduct was being dealt with informally. And so the whole purpose was to create a centralized system to at least find out what was going on. And I think that's what we found out. And it's no different than anything else I think we've done in the city. Once you put a focus on it, you find out there's maybe more workload than what we thought initially. So that was one part. The other thing I thought was important is that in addition to you handling, 30% or 40% of the complaints, do you have some role in managing the larger body of work that is being done out in the field and when it comes back for adjudication?
Yes, council member. Not only do we assign it, but when there are questions about the cases being handled by the field and or those completed investigations come back, they are reviewed for sufficiency, kicked back if they're not. If they are reviewed and adjudicated, and recommendations for any penalties from those investigations, and then the penalty part of it, the imposition of the penalty documents, the Board of Rights, is all done through PSD.
Okay,
so even though the actual investigation part may go back to the field, we manage the complaints.
So your role is greater than just the people the complaints you're investigating?
Yes.
Okay. The other thing, is it fairly routine that a case that's handled out in the field might end up with a penalty or a significant penalty, or that it goes to a Board of Rights, even though you try to balance complex and serious cases in one place? The investigation dictates the ultimate outcome.
Actually, what happens in those cases, if it's a field investigation, the reason why we give it to them is we believe that the level of investigation is commensurate with their training. If we become aware of a case which looks like it's much bigger than we initially thought, we will take it back and assign it to PSD because of the investigative quality needs to be such where we're comfortable with proceeding with any discipline.
But what drives that? Is that the investigation or just the original assessment?
It could happen, well, if it's the initial assessment and we've sent it to the field, it's based on that. Generally, when it happens is that we get progress reports or questions about the case, or we learn that the field's expanding the allegations or the scope. At that point, we'll take it back. Or even...
Yeah, but that's what I make the point. It's the investigation that drives it.
Yes.
Okay, because the thing is that there was some discussion last time whether you can just look at something and say it's frivolous, and I think you commented earlier that frivolous is only at the end of the investigation, not on the first review.
No, if it's something that is clearly outlandish or frivolous when we receive it, we'll close it out. But the overwhelming number of complaints requires someone to look into it. So.
And then who was part of the original stakeholder group? Do we remember that? Was that internal, or was that department personnel that created? Because I think they're the ones that came up with the recommendation about the professional standards. Do we know who?
Actually, the Fire Commission chaired the stakeholders process. Commissioner Hudley Hayes and Commissioner Tolentino, and then I think several labor organizations. We had the Stentorians, Los Bomberos. There were a number. UFLAC at one point. I'm not sure whether they completed the process or not.
Okay, so it wasn't just the commission decided to do this, or
No.
a committee and
No.
council.
No.
It actually was a group of people that are.
I think they spent up to 18 months working on this process. It was fairly exhaustive, and
Did it go through several levels of rank that participated?
it was a broad spectrum of the department that participated in the process. They worked day and night to produce it. So,
And they came up with the idea of the professional standard.
yes.
And then, could you remind, what is the statute? Is that a year, statute of limitation?
We're driven by two sets of statutes. One is the Fighter Bill of Rights mirrors the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, which is 1 year from the date of discovery of the alleged misconduct. Unfortunately, because we have not amended our charter provision 1060 to mirror the Bill of Rights, we still have to follow the charter, which is 1 year from date of discovery and then 2 years from the event. The big problem for us is the Bill of Rights allows for tolling of the statute of limitations under certain circumstances, such as a criminal investigation, civil litigation, whatever else. Because we don't have those tolling provisions in 1060 as police does in 1070, we have to do everything within that year. Or
What was the other part of 1070?
1060?
1060, what was it? You said it was.
It's 1 year from the date of discovery and in no event later than 2 years from the date of the event.
2 years. But you, primarily follow the state law?
We follow both.
I mean, how do you get in the 2 years from event if you comply with the state statute?
If we've been able to charge the individual within 1 year from date of discovery, it has to also be that the event's within 2 years, is what we've been
So the
advised.
state law doesn't preclude you from still using the 2 years?
My understanding, it doesn't doesn't trump it because it actually expands the rights for the employees. So we look at both of them. And again, where we get stuck is the Bill of Rights allows for tolling, which expands that time frame, but the charter doesn't. So
Bill of Rights gives you total.
yes, and the charter doesn't, so we stick with what the charter allows.
The other thing, there was last time, there's a lot of discussion about 1,000, 1,200 complaints. Can you kind of give us an idea, is that 1,000 people, or is that some people with multiple complaints, or how does that break down? Are there some people that never get a complaint?
Oh, yes. I mean, there are some members that have a number of complaints in there for whatever reason. They may be focused at a certain fire station because of issues there or whatever else. I'm happy to say that we never see the overwhelming number of firefighters in our office, nor do we have complaints against them.
So when we hear the 1,000, we shouldn't think 1/3 of the fire department is being investigated.
That is not the case, sir.
And then the other issue, could you give us some idea of the breakdown of the complaints? Are all of them sustained? A percentage of them sustained? How many of them are found unfounded? Just an idea.
Certainly, if you give me just a minute, please. Councilmember Parks, in 2010, we sustained 131 complaints. And when we say sustained, that means that we had evidence beyond a preponderance to believe that the allegations are true. That does not mean that punitive action was necessarily imposed. We might have sustained allegations, but we felt that a non-punitive course was appropriate, such as training and counseling.
So the sustaining and the penalty are separate?
Yes.
Okay. So if I look at this and you got 1,100, 1,200 complaints, you're talking, what, just the 10% are sustained?
Roughly.
Okay, and then what about just finding that they were unfounded?
Give me just a minute again, sir. I'm sorry. The overwhelming number of closed complaints that we have are not sustained and non-disciplinary, which means that there was no punitive action and we could not establish guilt. In terms of numbers of exonerated, 49 complaints in 2010, and unfounded were 34. So, and again, for your benefit, not sustained means that we could not say for certainty that it did not happen or that the actions were consistent with our policies. It's basically, we couldn't figure out what happened. Well, we didn't have enough to charge our member.
Is that the bulk of them?
Yes. And then exonerated means that what the actions alleged occurred, but they were within our department's policies or practices and were consistent with what the fire department expected. And then unfounded means that we were able to show by a preponderance that the allegations alleged did not occur.
Okay, so in about 90% of the time, you're actually, in most instances, finding in favor of the employee did nothing wrong.
Yes, sir.
That's not a bad average. So again, 90% of the time, you find employees did nothing wrong.
Yes, sir.
Or that they would not be punitive against them.
That would result in a reprimand or suspension or a board of rights.
I mean, so the key, it's to their benefit that you investigate them in most instances.
I believe so, and it again, looking into it.
I believe so. Okay, thank you. The other thing, I have 2 things to comment on the ombuds issue, and I think it's a viable program, but I would hope as you create it that it is separate from discipline, because if you merge it, you will then have 2 disciplinary systems, and so it absolutely has to have a clear line of things that might lead to discipline, things that might lead to misconduct. But if you ever stick a misconduct case into the ombuds office, it then dilutes your authority and really puts the system in jeopardy. So I'd hope as you craft that you keep those kinds of things in mind, because it doesn't work having a dual discipline system. Right. And then the last thing, the one thing, as there was comments about captains being captains. They can really perform a great service by being preventive and not allowing these kinds of things to go on in their station, and particularly not being involved with them. That's what captains being captains should be, that they're preventing firefighters from getting in trouble, and they're preventing that themselves are not participating in those misconduct. That's what we pay them to do, is supervise in that regard, as opposed to being a part of the discipline system. So that's what I would like to see captains being captains. Thank you. Thank you.
I got two follow-up questions.
Got one too. Following up on Mr. Park's question or comment about captains, in general, I was wondering about training, because obviously we're short on cash, and training firefighters to do their primary job is difficult. How much training do we do on identified problems? How much do we train captains? How much do we train rank and file on whatever the general problems may be? The ones I've seen in the press occasionally, hazing of new firefighters, or hazing of firefighters for whatever reason, problems with a relatively small number of women, but firefighters getting used to having women at their fire stations and not always acting appropriately. Are we doing much training on the preventative end?
Yes, obviously we're doing all of the mandated training, the HR training, zero tolerance, the annual stuff that goes on. But we also have our leadership academy, our West Point Leadership Academy, that we're taking all of our officers through. And our in-service training, like you said, the dollars have been short. And what we're getting ready to roll out is our e-learning platform. We're hopeful we're going to be doing a lot of online training here in the near future. So I think through time we're going to get better at it. But I think we're doing a much better job than we had in the past in controlling the work environment and training our people and understanding what a professional fire service organization is supposed to look like. And I think we're a lot better today than we were 5-6 years ago.
No, I have no doubt about that. I'm just wondering and just thinking out loud as a policy. Wait.
Engine 51, Squad 51.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please?
Test.
This is the Office of Public Safety. We are testing the fire safety of this building. This is only a test. May I have your attention, please?
You've
May I
got
have
it.
your attention, please?
OCD out.
This is the Office of Public Safety. We are testing the PA system of this building at this time. I repeat, this is
That's the fire code in action.
There you go. I was just thinking that to the extent we save money, we'd be better off putting a little more money of what we're allocating here towards training than having to correct the problems after the fact.
Right.
So I'd encourage you to, if you're short on funding for this particular arena, to let the council know and not just let it happen, because I think this is certainly one of the higher priorities to get these problems under control.
Right.
And they can cost us a lot of money after the fact. So any preventative things that we can do that we're not doing, let's do them.
Okay, we will.
Mr. Zine?
On the numbers you gave, the number of terminations, total number of days off that were given, on the 90% were unfounded, but the 10%, how many terminations during that period of time? How many received days off? Do you have those numbers?
The numbers that we have was since the creation of Professional Standards Division, we've had 17 terminations.
17?
Yes. I don't have a breakdown from the calendar year. Well, actually, let me look, Councilmember. I'm sorry. Maybe I spoke here.
And that's for a variety of criminal offenses or administrative? The 17?
Combination.
Oh.
Yes.
So there are obviously consequences for bad behavior.
I don't have a number of terminations for 2010, Councilmember, I'm sorry.
How about total days off? You had 70 terminations, total days off?
I don't believe we have that number here, sir. We were prepared for the terminations, but not for actual suspended.
Okay. But there are those numbers also?
Yes, sir.
So you get between 1 and 30 on the days off?
This number of suspended days?
Yes.
Is one? Yes, that's what we're able to get without going to a board.
And then if they go to a board, the board can give days and/or termination?
The board, under the charter, has the discretion to do no action up to termination.
No action. So they can't give days?
Oh, I'm sorry, they can't.
The days
No
or-
action, days, and then
Or
termination.
Okay. I'll jump
And,
again.
and we haven't had speakers yet from the public, so we have 2 speakers.
That's one favor.
Uh,
By the time this comes to council, could we just get a breakdown so you can give us an idea of adjudications and numbers by the time this item comes to council? Mr. Zion's question, terminations, days off, suspensions, things like that, so you just get an idea of the workforce.
Do you wish to have reported directly to your offices?
No, they can bring it to the council.
The day that we have it in council.
Okay, okay.
Exactly. Alicia Mathis, representing the Stakeholders Work Group, to be followed by Pat McCosker with United Firefighters.
Do you wish to give them 2 minutes a person?
I won't hold you too tightly to the 2 minutes.
Oh, you won't? Okay.
No, if you've got something key to say that goes longer than 2 minutes, that's fine.
Okay. Let me just start by thanking you for taking the time that you have to discuss this issue. We have met in the past. My name is Alicia Mathis. I'm a captain with the Los Angeles Fire Department. I've been on 22 years. I've been a captain for the past 9. I had an opportunity to meet early on with our federal mediator, who was the one who really established the guidelines for the Stakeholders Work Group. We met with him as a result of the audit that was conducted by Laura Chick, our controller. And we met with the federal mediator as part of Los Bomberos. At the time, I was the vice president of Los Bomberos organization. The federal mediator suggested that we bring to the table anybody who would be involved and be a stakeholder: women, minority groups, the union, Chief Officers Association, the fire chief at the time, who was Chief Bamatri, as well as members of our fire commission, which we did. We followed his orders directly. He said that it was a very important topic in terms of work environment issues. The issues addressed within the controller's audit were critical to the success of the department. At the time, we had probably 2 to 3% women within the organization, which is about what we still have, and identified many issues in terms of work environment, disciplinary process, investigations, and professional standards. As a result of our 18 months with the Stakeholders Work Group, we created what is now the Professional Standards Division. We wrote the disciplinary guidelines. We created the vision statement and goals of the department, and we were able to really do that work as a result of working with each other and with the federal mediator. And I think we've seen the work environment improve. As a captain, I have far fewer things to address now as I did in years past. As a firefighter, many of the men that I worked with never worked with a woman before they worked with me. And now what I find is it's changed. With Chief Peaks at the helm, I have to say personally, I feel safer. I know that women are regarded as equal professionals, and I've seen really a transformation of our culture. And that's what we're talking about here, is a transformation of our culture, a change in the way we do business. The first women firefighters were hired in 1984. So it's not been that long ago that women weren't in the work environment. And so I think a lot of this was a result of not having women in the fire stations. Now nearly every firefighter has worked in or around or reported to a woman. So my role has often been, as one of the pioneers in the organization, And now I've seen that cultural shift. I've had an opportunity to participate in how we do business. And I'm excited about the change that we've seen. I'm excited about bringing in civilians who are going to offer some fairness and consistency to a process that has often been unfair. And so I do hope that you approve these positions. Now, one of the recommendations that we made as part of the stakeholders work group was to pair uniform and civilian together, because it's important that you understand the culture of the fire department. We do live, work, sleep, eat together. We're a team, we operate as a team, and that's critical to our success on the fire ground and in other emergencies that we respond to. So I don't want to see that change. It's a house where we live and work together, but it does need to be professional as well. So I think that these additional positions as part of our PSD will be something that brings us even further forward. And I do think, I like your recommendation that we monitor how many cases come forward, because I do believe that we'll see a cultural shift where we won't have these kind of complaints. Some of it is new and different. Other is sort of that drawing the line in the sand of who we want to be and where we want to go. And then as we see that shift to firefighters that have always worked in stations and around women and others of ethnic, different ethnicities and other diversities, we'll start to see that shift in the culture even more.
Thank you. If I could ask you one question. How do you think we're doing, say, from where we were 10 years ago? If you had to rank it on a scale, with 10 being totally resolving the problems with women and interactions with women by the male firefighters, where would you say we are towards the goal of a 10?
It's difficult for me to say now with my 22 years on the job and as a supervisor. My position is different. I have to, maybe I could share with you a story that I had recently with a woman firefighter who worked for me. Several months ago, a captain worked on our shift, and she was riding on the truck, which I'm sure the hook and ladder is sort of the vehicle that everybody aims to ride on and likes to ride on.
The front or the back?
She was the top position, so she was going to go to the roof and cut the hole. So she was in that position. She had 3 years on the job and had been working with me for about 6 months. We had a sod captain that day, and he moved her from the truck to the engine. And she came up to the front office, and she was pissed. She was like, "I cannot believe he took me off the truck." And I said, "Well, let's see, what happened and what his justification was." And so I talked to her, got a little bit more background information on why and what she saw. Then I talked to the other captain that day and found out what his goal was in moving her. And we resolved the issue. We were able to handle it at the station level, which I think is the most appropriate place for most complaints. And later on, I sat down with her and I said, have you faced many other issues within your 3 years on the job? And she said, I'm really mad. And, this is really the first thing that's ever happened like this. And I looked at her and I thought, wow, if the first thing that has happened to you in your 3 years on the job is that you were moved from the truck to the engine, we're making progress. So I don't know if that illustrates my point.
I think it does very well, actually.
But that's what I'm seeing, I'm seeing that things are being brought to our attention and we're able to handle them. And I think that this will make more headway in terms of our ability to do that.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pat McCosker.
Thank you. Last week I came in on this topic and I spoke to you about it, and I said that I thought you might be wasting money, that there might be a better way to achieve a more disciplined fire department than the way we're going about it. We've had an unbelievable overreaction in my view, to incidents that took place in the past. By the way, I got 31 years on it. I think that morale is at an all-time low, and because of that, behavior is certainly no better. In other words, this discipline monstrosity we've created hasn't made things better in the fire department in my 31 years of experience. I think things are a bit worse, quite frankly. So I suggested there might be a better way to do it, that you should look at other options, and I think that was the action you took. I think that was the motion you passed to instruct the fire department, and they did show up in great numbers today, but to instruct the fire department to come in here and talk about other options besides just spending money and feeding the monster and building an empire, if it'd be possible to do something else besides just hiring more people. And I didn't hear that. I heard about 40 or 50 minutes of justification for hiring more people. Anyway, I came prepared to talk about alternatives. We've put them on the table. We proposed in negotiations several months ago several things that we think would cut down on the expense and cut down on the need for more and more and more staff in PSD. We proposed eliminating boards of rights, an unnecessary step in a process, and it's the most time-consuming, staff-consuming, expensive, incredibly expensive when you think of all the time you're buying, all the chief officers you're putting off on detail and hiring behind, and all the other staff that have to be used for a board of rights. We proposed not using captains to do investigations. Captains under the Bill of Rights can certainly admonish and correct and record and counsel people, but they shouldn't be doing investigations with Liebarger admonitions and tape recordings and all the kinds of things that they're doing right now. We proposed that as well. And 3 or 4 other things that would save money, make the process better, and make it, more importantly, perhaps more effective, creating a better, more disciplined fire department, because that's our goal. That's what we want. And we're not achieving it right now. I don't care whether or not you waste the money on this. I think that we all should care. We're closing 22 fire companies every day and 9 ambulances and a whole host of other companies. So we ought to be looking for ways to save money, not just building a bigger empire. But for me, it's not so much about are we or aren't we going to hire this additional civilian staff, but it's are we or aren't we going to take seriously the things that we're proposing to make this a better and more effective system. And I would ask you, if you don't do anything else today, please at least have the fire department report back, have us all report back on the progress of the negotiations, because we're being completely and totally ignored on the proposals we've made at the table to make our discipline system better.
Let me just respond, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Certainly.
I made a motion, and I think this committee will support an annual review of Professional Standards Bureau that will come back to this committee, as well as, if need, public safety. The issue of fairness and a board of rights, they stated 17 firefighters were terminated. I believe you have to have a fair system, and a board of rights brings out all the facts. So I would support a board of rights in the case of a firefighter's career. When 17 folks are no longer firefighters terminated, the fairness has to be part of it. And I believe that the captains belong in the field. I don't think the captains should be doing investigations, and this new process will relieve those captains of that responsibility. They will be in the field where they belong, as the one captain stated, to counsel, to direct, to supervise. And the meet and confer is an issue that obviously you have with the City of Los Angeles on the meet and confer on the contract. That's not what we do in this committee or any other committee. So the meet and confer issue regarding the working conditions, hours, wages, working conditions, comes up at the table when you're negotiating with the CAO, the CLA, and all those other entities. What we need to do in this particular committee, personnel, is regarding the direction of personnel. But we don't have a play in this particular committee as far as the meet and confer and the suggestions, which may be very valid, to direct. And Marita, you're on the personnel, on the negotiating team, but this isn't the form that we do that meet and confer. I'm not saying it's not necessary, but it's not done here in the Personnel Committee. So I think if we do the annual review, we'll answer some of those questions. And I think we give an opportunity to clean up those cases. And if it reduces and the culture changes, as the one captain's testified, and I was going to ask, 22 years ago when you came on, you're probably one of the few females on the fire department, and how you were treated back then to where it is now, where you're the captain in charge of the command of that particular station house. So I think it's a balance. And I respect what you do, and I know the union responsibility, but when you negotiate this at the table, board of rights, no board of rights, my focus is you need to have a fair system where they know they can get a fair shake, and I think the board of rights gives a fair shake. I have been a victim of a Board of Rights when I was with the police department. And if it wasn't for those Board of Rights, I probably wouldn't be a city councilman. I probably would have been terminated. But the Board of Rights was fair, and I believe the right result came out. But that's why I believe in having the fairness. And if you lose the fairness doctrine, then you lose the whole ship. Then you have total disgruntled people that are constantly bailing out. And the firefighter's a career. The LAPD's a career. Many people in the city. City attorney, how long you been here?
10 years.
10 years. Well, you're only a newbie then.
Yeah, I agree.
Well,
It's a career focus, so that's what I'm looking at. So I see what you're saying, but that's a meet and confer issue that most of the things you brought up.
Well, Mr. McCosker, I'd probably ask whomever the appropriate person is from the city attorney's office to give me some guidance on this, because I'd be inclined, and not so much in the context of meet and confer on what we agree to, but in the context of the policy, I wish there was some way to ask for a report back on what proposals have been discussed and whether there are things that make sense among the AFLAC proposals, but not so much in a context of what's.
EFLAC.
Did I say AFLAC?
EFLAC.
AFLAC, excuse me. Because I'd like to make sure that if there are good ideas out there, that they're being considered, and if there are more efficient ways to do this, I don't care about the negotiation part of the process. I just want to make sure that all good ideas for this system are given a fair discussion, and that we get some discussion of it here as well.
Do that ERC, Mr. Chair,
We'll go to the ERC.
and you're a member now.
Can I address something regarding
we-
the Board of Rights? Because it needs to be understood.
Hang on a sec. I guess we could make a motion to have that question brought to the ERC and put on.
Certainly, you get updates on negotiations relative to your sworn bargaining units at ERC, and that's something that could be discussed.
If we could ask for that specific
Yeah,
bit of
certainly,
information.
Maria Assman from the CAO's office, we can agendize that for a future ERC meeting.
Yeah, maybe.
But not for this committee.
No, not for,
But
but
if we
for
could,
ERC.
if this committee could ask that be done, I think that perhaps that's the best legal forum. But I would like to know what's being asked and whether there are some good ideas out there that we might want to weigh in on.
And certainly, I think in the context of updates on negotiations, that would definitely be an appropriate topic.
And Mr.
Inappropriate here.
Appropriate at the ERC.
Oh, appropriate.
Appropriate there, inappropriate here.
We're having, your discussions with your negotiators take place in closed session at ERC, yes.
And you're now a member.
Right, so that'll work out one way or the other. I'll give you one more sec to.
Thanks. So because I just want to clarify, I understand Mr. Zine and I agree that every firefighter, every police officer deserves a review. That's why I'm the father of the firefighter Bill of Rights in the state. That law that we achieved, that I started and we achieved, says that every firefighter is entitled to that review, either from an administrative law judge or its equivalent. And in our case, we have binding arbitration of discipline cases. So you have that review, that final say, that is the last step. But in between that, because we've got an archaic city charter, we've got this kangaroo court that you call a Board of Rights that really isn't the final word. And it's a hurdle our people have to jump over to get justice at the end, and it's very expensive. That's why we propose getting rid of that, letting the fire chief impose or decree whatever discipline he thinks is appropriate. And if we think it's not, and if it's not, we'll take it in front of that arbitrator and get that final word on it. And it'll be a lot cheaper for everybody, a lot more fair for the firefighter. So I'm not suggesting that the people that I represent aren't entitled to review before they're fired, believe me.
But wasn't that a charter change? The Board of Rights?
It does require a charter change, but the first step is get,
But the Board of Rights was a charter change to bring that into the fire
well, it's
department.
in the city charter. It's probably a very long time now in the city
No, it
charter.
hasn't been that long, because the charter was updated 10 years ago. So it was part of that revision, as I recall,
But
somewhere
the,
around
I
that
think
time.
I think Bill Parker did that
No, for the fire department?
for the police fire at 202.
certainly as long as I've been on the fire department, it's been a
Well, I know the charter was updated 10 years ago as a charter commissioner. I remember
They
discussing
changed,
that.
they changed the code section, but it was 202 for decades.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, well,
Anyway, so I'd make that motion that we have that annual review on the matters.
so we'll move that we
With that,
have annual review. We'll move the report request to EERC, and We've had a verbal commitment from the chief to create an ombudsman position as a reform to help us streamline this process.
And authorize the positions.
And yes, and we authorize the positions, which is the main item that is before us. So without objections, that one will all move forward, and we are adjourned.